The comments sat in the replies for weeks, unacknowledged. A viewer named @MastHeart5723 had read everything laid out about the 11th Primarch and posted this. Okay, so if the 11th was a Null Primarch, then wouldn't that mean being a Null is a part of their Geneseed? If so, then the whole thing about the Ultramarines absorbing them would have to be false. Otherwise, there would have to be observation of null anomalies coming from these converted Ultramarines. No likes, no response. One question that contains a structural problem the prior video, and frankly, most lore discussions in this space, never seriously addressed. If the 11th Primarch was a blank, his Geneseed would encode that condition into every Marine ever built from his template. Absorbing those Marines into the Ultramarines wouldn't produce a few oddities quietly contained. It would produce, across 10,000 years of continuous Geneseed propagation, a measurable and unavoidable null signature across the Ultramarines and all 51+ successor chapters their line eventually generated. That signature doesn't exist anywhere in the canonical record. Not in a single tithe report, not in a single after-action entry, not in one successor chapter out of 51. We're not rebuilding the Null Primarch theory from the foundation. If you've seen the prior video, you already know the core. The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski Bowden contains a vision scene showing all 20 Primarch gestation pods, with the 11th Primarch's pod present and occupied while every record of his existence has been systematically stripped from imperial history. The case for why the Primarch was hidden rather than destroyed is already built. What wasn't addressed is the exact contradiction @MastHeart5723 identified. If the Legion's Geneseed entered the Ultramarines, where is the genetic evidence? One honest clarification before we build this case. What follows is a logical deduction from canonical rules, not a direct statement from any official Games Workshop publication. The rules of the setting are canonical. Their necessary conclusion isn't. Follow them far enough without stopping early, and you arrive somewhere the Imperium can't afford to let anyone look. A blank, also called an untouchable, a psychic null, a pariah, or informal imperial classification, an omega-psyker, isn't defined by something they do. It's defined by something they can't stop doing. The mutation tied to what the setting calls the pariah gene causes the individual's mind to exude a negative psionic field that disrupts psychic phenomena in a radius and renders them completely immune to all psychic effect. Their presence in the warp isn't visible as an absence. It's described as a consuming void, a black hole in the immaterium that doesn't merely block psychic energy but pulls it in and devours it. Not a wall, a drain. 3 specific properties of that field are the scientific spine of everything that follows. The aura is passive and involuntary. It doesn't require activation. Temporarily disabling it through concentration or willpower isn't possible. The Sisters of Silence, the all-female militant order whose ranks consist entirely of null maidens drawn from untouchable stock, operating under the Adeptus Astra Telepathica from their headquarters at the Somnus Citadel on Luna, aren't trained to project disruption. They're trained to function as warriors, despite carrying it at all times. Their most senior battlefield operators, the Oblivion Knights, are described in canonical records as having developed their null abilities to the point where any use of psychic powers in their proximity becomes hazardous to the user. That's a refinement of degree. The disruption was always present. Oblivion Knights didn't acquire the aura through mastery. They learned to operate around a field that was already there and always working.
The Calexis Assassins,
of the Officio Assassinorum illuminate this with specific mechanical precision. Their signature equipment, the animus speculum, channels energy their aura passively drains from the surrounding warp into a directed anti-psychic beam. The device doesn't generate the field. It harnesses energy from a process already occurring in the Colexus's biology at all times. When the mask is off, when they're asleep, when they're moving through a crowded corridor in civilian clothing. External limiter technology, devices designed to dampen a blank's field from the outside, exists specifically because the aura can't be reduced through will or discipline alone. If a blank could simply decide to stop radiating, external limiters would be engineering without a purpose. The effect on recipients is permanent and non-adaptive. The null aura never fades. People in constant contact with a blank never grow numb to it. This matters enormously because it closes the most intuitive counter-argument, that soldiers adapt to difficult conditions. They do adapt to almost everything. Extreme cold, chronic noise, proximity to unstable machinery. Habituation is one of the most reliable features of human psychology. The blank's field doesn't work through pathways that accommodate repeated exposure. It operates by directly disrupting the connection between a living being's empiric soul and the warp at a biological level continuously. The mechanism isn't a stimulus that eventually fades with familiarity. It's an ongoing interference the body can't build tolerance to because tolerance requires the cause to eventually stop. And it never stops. The effect escalates with proximity and blank potency, and at sufficient concentration, it kills. Baseline blanks produce unease in ordinary humans and mild disruption in minor psychers. Stronger blanks produce disorientation, nausea, and seizures in psychers at moderate proximity. The Colexus assassins at the apex of the spectrum can kill trained psychers without any weapon contact. Proximity alone is sufficient. The question for a powerful psycher facing a weak blank isn't whether they're disrupted, but whether they can force residual ability through the suppression. Against a strong blank, that question doesn't arise. Astartes librarians aren't exempt. The canonical battlefield role of the Sisters of Silence during both the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy confirms this directly. They were deployed against enemy Astartes psychers, traitor legion librarians, their null auras suppressing warp-based abilities while assault forces push through the gap. That tactical function depends on blank proximity actively disabling Astartes-level psychic capability. It worked consistently enough to become standard operational doctrine. One final property: the condition is heritable. The pariah gene is explicitly described as heritable, with a direct correlation between a blank parent and a blank offspring. Certain human populations carry higher baseline frequencies of blank births, communities whose local gene pool has drifted toward higher expression of the trait. The Sisterhood of Silence reportedly maintains genetically stable bloodlines of pariahs specifically to sustain their own recruitment supply. The Colexus Temple cultivates what it calls protophages, vat-grown blanks produced through controlled breeding rather than found in the wider population. You don't vat-grow something you can't breed true. The condition propagates through standard biological transmission. It's inheritable, consistent across generations, and manageable through selective cultivation. Space Marine Geneseed isn't a standardized parts kit deployed from a neutral chassis. This distinction is the hinge on which the entire argument turns.
The 19 standard implant organs of a firstborn Astartes, the osma jula that restructures bone density,
the biskopia driving muscular development, the neuroglottis enhancing chemical detection, the Becher's gland, the Laraman's organ, and the rest of the full suite are the visible, functional component. But those organs derive from a Primarch's genome. The Geneseed doesn't just carry organ templates, it carries the complete genome they grew from, and transmits that genome as a living, heritable system through every recruit it reshapes. The Primaris Project's founding records state this directly. The Sang Primus Portum, a device containing potent genetic material harvested from the Primarchs themselves, entrusted by Guilliman to Call shortly after the second founding in the early 31st millennium, was what made the enhanced Primaris Astartes biologically possible. The Geneseed is a Primarch's genome propagated as a heritable biological system. What lives in that genome travels with it through every generation. The blood angels are the cleanest proof the system carries everything with no filter. The red thirst is a Geneseed flaw, not a cultural inheritance, not a warp contamination spreading through proximity or ceremony, but a specific defect encoded in Sanguinius's genome and transmitted through every tithe of Geneseed drawn from blood angels' progenoid glands. Every successor chapter from every founding carries it, regardless of homeworld, tactical tradition, or how many millennia they've operated at remove from Baal. The flesh terrors carry it. The angels in carmine carry it. The blood drinkers carry it. A warrior recruited from a feral world thousands of light years from Baal, 10,000 years after Sanguinius's death, still carries the red thirst because the Geneseed that rebuilt his physiology contains Sanguinius's genome. The flaw isn't in the chapter's history, it's in their cells. The Black Rage follows the same inheritance pathway. Whatever its precise mechanism, the psychic death imprint of a Primarch reproduced through the resonance of his genome, it propagates through every generation of recruits drawn from blood angels' Geneseed. The historical record distinguishes the two conditions clearly. The red thirst appeared in isolated Great Crusade-era cases predating Sanguinius's death, while the Black Rage emerged only from the Siege of Terra. Two distinct heritable conditions in a single template, both propagating indefinitely across every successor generation. The Space Wolves confirm that behavioral and physical traits beyond the standard implant suite travel through Geneseed with equal reliability. The Canis helix isn't a supplementary implant or a separate chemical administered during recruitment. It's an element of Space Wolf Geneseed derived from Lehman-Russ's template that mutates the host's DNA on implantation, producing elongated canines, yellowed eyes, enhanced senses beyond standard Astartes parameters, accelerated body hair growth, and the feral behavioral pressure referred to as the wolf within. Aspirants whose genetics can't fully integrate it either die during the trial or transform into wolfen, the trait expressing uncontrollably and consuming the recruit entirely. Every space wolf carries this, not as tradition, as biology. The Thousand Sons are the most directly relevant precedent. Recruits implanted with Magnus the Red's template frequently manifested latent psyker abilities with no prior expression in their own genetic history, because Magnus's genome encoded psychic predisposition into the template. Psychic capability itself, not physical mutation, not behavioral instinct, but psionic potential, transmitted through Geneseed. The same gene line also carried the flesh change, uncontrolled catastrophic mutation so severe that the Thousand Sons Geneseed is permanently classified by the Imperium as unusable. The mutation risk isn't external contamination acquired after the fact.
It's built into the template and propagates indefinitely through every generation it reaches. 3 independent gene lines. physical mutations, behavioral predispositions, psychic capability, heritable catastrophic instability. Geneseed carries all of it. There's no established principle in the setting by which it would selectively fail to transmit the pariah gene if that gene were encoded in the originating Primarch's genome. What follows is the logical conclusion. No official source states this. The mechanics are canonical. The conclusion belongs to those mechanics. If the 11th Primarch carried the pariah gene, then his Geneseed encoded it. Every Marine ever recruited from that template would carry it in their biology, exactly as every Blood Angels recruit carries the Red Thirst, every Space Wolf carries the Canis Helix, and every Thousand Suns recruit carried Magnus's psychic predisposition. The question becomes whether that gene would express as dominant or recessive. In genetics, a dominant trait expresses in every individual carrying even one copy of the relevant allele. Brown eye color expresses whenever a brown allele is present, regardless of what the second allele contributes. A recessive trait requires two matching copies to manifest. A single carrier looks entirely normal and passes the trait forward silently. Even granting maximum conservatism, fully recessive gene, very low initial frequency in the Primarch's template, population genetics doesn't permit Legion scale absorption to produce 0 observable blanks across 10,000 years. At a 5% allele frequency in a founding population, approximately 1 individual in 400 would express a recessive trait. Apply that conservatively to 10,000 absorbed Marines, roughly 25 observable blank Astartes in the first generation alone. More critically, a recessive allele doesn't disappear across subsequent generations under neutral selection. It reaches a stable equilibrium frequency and persists there, producing new expressing individuals in every cohort of recruits as long as the Geneseed line continues. If the gene behaves as dominant, the numbers become catastrophic. Roughly half of all first-generation recruits from a heterozygous Primarch's template would carry and express the trait. In a legion numbering in the tens of thousands at the height of the Great Crusade, that's thousands of blank Astartes distributed through every company, every assault element, every command structure. Take even the conservative case, 25 blank Marines placed inside the Ultramarines. A single one stands in the tactical line before an assault. 3 positions to his left, an Ultramarine librarian prepares to reach for the warp. The blank isn't concentrating. He isn't pointing anything. He's standing there, as he has stood in every formation since his implantation, his field operating at the same involuntary intensity it's maintained continuously since his Geneseed took hold. The librarian reaches for the warp and finds it inaccessible, static that thickens the more he extends. Not enemy jamming, not local warp instability. The Marine standing 3 positions left. After-action reports begin accumulating unexplained entries. Anti-psychic interference from within their own formation. Librarian support failing at critical moments with no external cause. Tactical doctrines built around coordinated psychic deployment producing inconsistent results against enemies with no known anti-psychic capabilities. The disruption follows the same individuals across different campaigns, different sectors, different warp conditions, a pattern without external explanation. The Mechanicus Tive agents processing progenoid glands harvested from these Marines, the biological mechanism by which Geneseed is collected, tested, and redistributed, detects something in those samples that matches no standard Astartes genetic profile.
The biologist analysts, whose entire institutional function is to identify and classify Geneseed aberrations, flag the affected stock. They restrict it. They report upward. The Geneseed oversight apparatus is specifically designed to catch heritable anomalies at exactly this scale. There's no path around it through post-hoc biological correction. The Imperium has no documented capability to isolate a specific heritable trait from a Primarch's genome and extract it while preserving the rest of the template intact. When a Geneseed line becomes unacceptably contaminated, as the Thousand Sons demonstrated, the Imperial response is quarantine or destruction of the line, not trait-level surgical editing. The Blood Angel's Geneseed flaws have persisted for 10,000 years of careful study, because removing them without ending the line isn't possible. What's built into a Primarch's genome is permanent. A pariah gene in an absorbed template would be there indefinitely. Every Marine, every generation, every tithe harvest, every successor chapter. The widely repeated claim that the Ultramarines absorbed the 11th Legion's Marines and Geneseed isn't an established official account. This argument is disproving. It's a rumor, discussed by characters within the fiction, that accumulated the weight of accepted fact through repetition across lore communities. No GW Codex and no Black Library novel confirms it as a historical event. What the canonical record does confirm: both legions existed, established through the numbering gap in official records. Both were deliberately expunged, not organically forgotten, but actively erased, from all known Imperial archives. The erasure was complete before Istvan V, where only 18 legions are referenced. The first heretic contains a vision sequence in which all 20 Primarch gestation pods are shown, the 11th's occupied and intact, while the novel confirms the word-bearers characters who witnessed the memory of the lost formations made a personal oath to never speak those names again. Not a bureaucratic restriction imposed on them. A voluntary silence chosen by chaos-aligned Astartes with no remaining loyalty to the Imperium and every operational reason to exploit such information if they chose. That oath tells you something. Whatever they understood about the 11th Legion was something even those men treated as requiring a promise. The gene vault in that scene holds Primarchs, not legions. The pod contains the Primarch, singular, preserved, stored. His legion wasn't there because the legion wasn't what was being preserved. The vault held something the Emperor couldn't afford to lose. Not the soldiers, the source. In the Lightning Tower, Rogel Dorn references two separate tragedies that necessitated the universal censure of both lost legions' records. Two tragedies, not one consolidated event. Two distinct endings requiring two distinct decisions to erase. The phrasing reportedly used when Dorn discussed the lost formations, the lost and the purged, doesn't treat both legions as having encountered the same kind of ending. In Imperial military terminology applied to an Astartes formation, purged isn't a synonym for absorbed or redistributed. It describes what happens to a force that couldn't be retained or integrated. Dorn was personally involved in the discussions about what to do with the surviving legionaries. He chose that word. The Ultramarines' Geneseed is described in canonical records as the purest stock in the Imperium, with no known aberrations in its genetic structure. Not merely the cleanest among flawed options. A gene line in which no documented deviation has been recorded across 10,000 years of continuous monitoring. The Ultramarines maintained an active librarius throughout their full documented history. They attended the Council of Nicaea in 001 M31 as a legion with an established and functioning core of librarians. After the heresy and the relaxation of the Nicaea edicts, the librarius was reconstituted and became one of the defining features of Ultramarine chapter culture. Their chief librarian in M41, Tigurius, is described across the canonical record as among the most powerful individual psychers in the entire Imperium.
This isn't a chapter that occasionally deployed combat psychers. It's a chapter whose tactical doctrine is built around librarian warfare, whose most celebrated specialists are its librarians, and whose psyker tradition runs unbroken from the Great Crusade through the Plague Wars of M42. More than 50 named successor chapters draw Geneseed from the Ultramarine line, more descendants than any other Primarch's gene line produced. The Codex Astartes, authored by Guilliman himself, makes the Ultramarines the template against which all other chapters are measured. The Mechanicus Geneseed oversight apparatus monitors this line in particular, precisely because its scale means any deviation propagates through more chapters than almost any other single source in the Imperium. Across 10,000 years of the most extensively monitored Geneseed tradition in the Imperium, spanning 51+ successor chapters, an unbroken librarian tradition documented from Nicaea to the era Indomitus, and a purity record explicitly described as unmatched. Not one documented blank Astartes appears anywhere in the Ultramarine lineage. Not one after-action report describes anomalous anti-psychic interference from within their own formations. Not one Mechanicus tithe record notes aberrant anti-psychic properties in any progenoid harvest from any Ultramarine line. Not one successor chapter in any published source carries any documented connection to the null condition. The Primaris project documentation is specific about what its enhanced Geneseed represents in terms of stability. A 0.001% chance of genetic deviancy from the original baseline per generation, contrasted explicitly against the documented instability of the Blood Angels and Space Wolves lines. That figure describes a Geneseed from which meaningful deviations have essentially never been detected in practice. Any contamination by a heritable anti-psychic gene would appear in biologists' analysis of affected progenoid glands. At legion-scale absorption, it would appear in the first generation. It would propagate through every subsequent generation. It would be present in the Geneseed of every successor chapter drawn from Ultramarine stock for the next 10,000 years. It isn't there. 10,000 years, 51 chapters, continuous institutional monitoring, complete silence. That silence is the evidence. The Primaris Project's canonical record contains one sentence that functions as the critical structural admission. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call collected samples of the genomes of all 20 of the original Primarchs, including those deemed lost or traitors, though Robute Guilliman made clear to his over-eager servant that Primaris Astartes were to be created only from one of the lines of those of his brothers who led the 9 loyalist Space Marine legions. All 20, including the lost. Call had those templates. This is stated in the canonical Primaris Marines record, not inferred from community debate. Call held the genetic material of the 11th Primarch and worked with it for 10,000 years in the vaults beneath Mars, while Guilliman lay in stasis on Macragge. When Guilliman returned in M42 and surveyed what his Archmagos had built, his instruction on this specific point was targeted and precise. Don't create Primaris Marines from the lost Primarch's templates. Not, those gene lines are unusable. Not, those templates were destroyed with the Primarchs. Don't use them. The templates exist. Call has them. They're off limits by direct personal instruction from the Lord Commander of the Imperium.
A viewer on the prior video, at Bill Hansen 4921, whose comment gathered 70 likes, identified the implication before the canonical record confirmed it. The only person who would have a clue is Call, because he got the template for all 20 Primarchs from Guilliman. The community intuition was tracking something real. Call is, by Guilliman's own characterization, an archmagos who operates well beyond sanctioned boundaries, who manipulated Catan shards, developed technologies Guilliman never authorized, and spent 10,000 years interpreting a single standing commission as liberally as the language would permit. Guilliman finds him simultaneously invaluable and alarming in roughly equal measure. Against that established pattern of habitual boundary crossing, Guilliman drew one specific line around two specific templates. Among all the corrupted, forbidden, and dangerous gene lines in Call's archive, traitor Geneseed included, the two lost lines were the ones Guilliman personally restricted by name. An archmagos who spent 10 millennia sequencing every genome he possessed would have mapped the 11th's template in full detail. He would have understood, with 10,000 years of analytical refinement, what any legion built from that template would produce, and specifically, what it would do to every allied psyker who served beside it. Guilliman, who defined the project's parameters before entering stasis, and who handed Call the Sang Primus Portum, understood this too. He saw what was in the 11th's genome, and made a decision about what it meant for the Ultramarine lineage. In M42, in the Dark Imperium era, Guilliman characterizes his missing brothers as doubtless all dead. The Logos Historica Verita has investigated the legends and found nothing credible. This is the same Guilliman who returned from stasis, expressing sustained frustration at the Imperium's deteriorated record-keeping standards, who designed the Codex Astartes specifically because he believed systematic institutional memory was the foundation of long-term imperial survival. The man who finds poor documentation professionally intolerable publicly positions himself as simply lacking useful information about two Primarchs whose Geneseed he's been curating for 10 millennia through Call's archive. He was the one who handed Call the templates. He was the one who drew the restriction. He sealed those specific gene lines with his own hands and his own authority, and has maintained those boundaries across 10,000 years while publicly characterizing the question as closed. The weight of a decision like that doesn't appear in any official record, but decisions of that magnitude leave marks, not on armor, not in battle reports, but on the man who made them and has carried them alone ever since. Guilliman wasn't being malicious. He was being Guilliman. The same cold architectural clarity that produced the Second Founding, which voluntarily fractured the most powerful fighting force in the Imperium into smaller, doctrine-bound pieces to prevent any future Horus-scale catastrophe, looked at a legion of blank Astartes and calculated what they represented. They couldn't be integrated into any standard operational context without disabling every allied psyker beside them. They couldn't deploy with the Ultramarines, whose tactical doctrine ran on librarian support, without the blank field undermining that doctrine in every engagement. Their Geneseed, if allowed into the Ultramarine pool, would contaminate.